Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Agahi with your host, Warisa Zainab. Agahi is a program where we always discuss issues around mental health, psychological well-being, and spirituality. And we try to cover topics that are important, affect each one of us, and we need to talk about certain issues that are often classified as taboo topics, but it has a great impact on everyone's well-being and it directly impacts the overall society as well. In today's show, we are going to speak about child abuse, the different types, and we will also share some information on how it can be prevented and how a victim can be saved or protected. In today's episode of Agahi, we are going to welcome our guest, Tara Alston. And I'll ask Tara to introduce herself and share with our viewers the amazing work that she does to support her local community. Tara, once again, welcome to Agahi.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. My name, as you said, was Tara Alston, and I am the founder and owner of Yet Still I Stand, LLC. And that is an organization that I utilize to speak on my story, which is a story of trauma and healing. And I also provide one-on-one consultations and workshops and speak on topics of trauma. And I also have a book that is soon to be published called Yet Still I Stand, where I tell my story.
Thank you so much for that. I'm looking forward to that book, and I'm sure lots of viewers would love to read it to get to know what it's all about. So today's topic is on child abuse, and the Crime Survey for England and Wales estimated that 1 in 5 adults aged 18 to 74 years have experienced one form of child abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual, and they experience that at least before the age of 16. So, as you know, the statistics are quite shockingly high, and it's one of those topics that people don't generally talk about, but it's happening on a daily basis, and we've seen a sudden increase in cases of child abuse during lockdown, especially. So, first of all, Tara, I would like you to touch upon what child abuse is all about. What does it look like?
As you mentioned, child abuse has many different forms. There are physical forms of child abuse that can range from any type of physical situation that happens that can cause marks on children, can cause different injuries. And so the physical abuse, there's a wide range of things, as you can imagine, that could happen. It's any type of abuse that you would consider a physical abuse for an adult as well. And then there is that sexual abuse, and that would occur anytime there is any inappropriate sexual activity or conditions of things being shared that are inappropriate for that age group, that would be sexually based. And exploitation is another form of child sexual abuse. And then emotional abuse would be another big factor that I think often isn't as talked about as the physical abuse and sexual abuse.
What about neglect?
Neglect?
We often hear about cases on media, and I've come across so many news that a child was subjected to neglect by the parents or the caregivers, and as a result, the child sustained injuries or, malnutrition or, even death in some cases.
Yes, and neglect is another big form of child abuse. And I think that oftentimes with neglect, it can go to the point of such severity because oftentimes children who are neglected aren't also around others as often. So it may not be noticed as soon as something like physical abuse.
What is the most common age group where a child suffers any form of abuse?
I don't know that I have information about the most common age group. I would venture to say that it's likely that those younger and not attending school, for instance, are probably the most vulnerable to it and not being prevented and not also being determined that that's occurring. And that would be because they're mostly inside the home. And so they don't have access to as many people who would be watching out for them. So I would venture to say that that would be the most vulnerable age group.
Yeah. In different parts of the world, it happens in different contexts. Sometimes it is often perpetrated by a family member or a family friend, somebody you trust, somebody you would trust your child with. Yes. It also happens, unfortunately, within schools and, educational institutions, in daycare centers. And these are places where mostly parents kind of trust their child to go to. And I mean, in the UK, we have a really strict, check that a person who works with a young person or child has to go through in order to get that position or job. But still, unfortunately, some people get away with it.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of that is because so many times child abuse is not reported. So the people that may be getting, we have background checks that people have to go through in order to work someplace like that. But if nobody's reported any type of abuse that this person has done against someone else, then nothing's going to show up on that report. So there's many times where it's not reported and doesn't show up on the background checks, and they oftentimes position themselves in places where they'll have access to children if they're in fact someone who wants to abuse a child.
So for someone who is like a family member or a teacher, maybe a friend or a colleague, what are the signs or symptoms to look out for? Surely there has to be like indicators that would help you recognize that there's something going on.
I believe that there are some common indicators that you can watch for. Of course, every child is different and every situation is different. So there may be additional things that you would notice that would be off. But for instance, if a child starts acting completely different, like their behavior changes, that's an indication that something is wrong. So anytime that occurs, you want to be looking into what the situation is and as a possibility of abuse. Obviously, if you see any types of physical signs of abuse, that would be a huge red flag that you would want to look into. If they show inappropriate knowledge or behavior of things that wouldn't be normal for their age group, that's also something that may be an indicator of things such as sexual abuse. And just if they show fear about being around anybody or going someplace, that's something else I would watch for. So there are some common things that I would look for.
Mm-hmm. And like you mentioned, that many cases remain underreported, and many cases of child abuse, they remain hidden and do not necessarily enter the criminal justice system. And that kind of encourages the cycle of abuse as well as the perpetrators, because they feel they can get away with it. So what can we do to ensure that if something is going on, or if we suspect that this child or young person may be being abused either at home, online, or even by a teacher, what can we do to ensure the safety of this person?
If it is suspected and or maybe the child is saying something to you, I think it's important that, first of all, we don't act overly emotional, because that can cause them to become afraid and not want to talk, because they may be concerned that what they're saying is making you upset with them versus you're upset about the situation. So I think that is a number one thing to think about as you may be experiencing a child coming to you, or you noticing something that is wrong. I think it's also really important to let the child know that it was good if they did come to you and trust you with that, and that they are not in trouble. Because so often abusers will try to tell children, if anybody finds out about this, you're going to be in trouble. So we have to keep this a secret. So making sure that they understand that as they're starting to talk, that you're not going to be in trouble for talking to me. And making sure also that you don't ask leading questions, I think is important for possible future investigations, as well as, wanting to get to the truth and not possibly putting something into a child's head that didn't really occur, but now they're confused with all the other things that they are experiencing and the emotions that they have. So I think that that's important too. Mm-hmm. But then reporting what you suspect or what you know based on what the child is telling you, I think is really important as well.
I know that you do a lot of work around different forms of abuse, not just child abuse, but also domestic abuse is one of the things that you're quite passionate about. And I came across a really interesting research that suggested that 52% of the adult population that experienced some kind of child abuse before the age of 16, they also ended up in abusive relationships in later adulthood. And the link is pretty much interesting. And to understand this link, that why is it that people who have experienced child abuse often end up in relationships with people who would abuse them or take advantage of their vulnerability? Why do you think that often happens?
I think it's twofold. On the part of the victim, I think it's because oftentimes kids who are abused, let's say, for instance, at home, they don't know what it looks like to have a healthy relationship because they've grown up in abuse. So some of the things that they may experience from somebody else as an adult that a lot of people would be like, there's no way I would live with that, could actually not even be a red flag for somebody who's grown up in abuse, because it's a situation to where it feels normal. It's not pleasant, but it still feels normal. It's not a huge red flag. So I think that can be part of the issue. But I also believe that abusers and those who try to do harm to others, they often look for somebody who has insecurities and maybe not a strong support system. And there are just certain things that until you've grown and healed that are a part of you when you have been abused. And so I think they look for those types of vulnerabilities in order to believe that then they can do the things that they want to do.
You talked about the different forms, and if it's a case of physical abuse, for example, it can be recognized or identified much easier because you can actually see the bruises, for example, or the wounds or scars.
Yes.
When it comes to emotional abuse going on at home, that's often difficult to recognize. So how can we identify that?
There are some ways that it would be hard to determine that is for sure the case without digging a little deeper. It just being evident on the surface is going to be very difficult to know that these are for sure because of emotional abuse. Children could be either very, very reserved because they're fearful of somebody talking mean to them because maybe that's what they're used to hearing, or they don't feel very self-confident, and so they're just very quiet and very reserved. Or it can go to the complete opposite, to where a child could be starting to bully others and being mean to others and kind of lashing out at others because that's what they hear, and it builds up a lot of anger, and then they end up doing things like that possibly. So those would be indicators, like the extremes, I think, would be indicators to where I would be looking a little deeper to try to find out what's going on. And or if it's a parent that is emotionally abusing a child, a lot of times you can tell if you're around that parent and child together for very long, because there are certain tones or certain things that they're saying, or the child looking afraid or defeated when they're around their parents. So watching things like that, I think, is a key factor in trying to make that determination as well.
Talking about like online, abuse. We know that 1 in 5 children are solicited to sexually, solicited sexually online on the internet. And for children, it's very difficult to, first of all, recognize so that they can protect themselves. And usually it happens behind closed doors, so the family may be completely unaware. They may not be able to share this with anyone. And before they can actually reach out to someone for help, it may be too late. So what can parents or caregivers do to protect their children online?
It's really important to monitor what's happening online with our children because of what you just said, that the predators are definitely in the social media platforms and in the gaming platforms and pretty much any type of platform that they can get access to children. They're going to be on there, and they oftentimes will pretend that they are other children and try to befriend the children and kind of build that trust in some sort of, I mean, it's not a real friendship, but try to build a friendship so that then they can start asking for little things from the children and kind of break down that wall to where then they can ask for bigger things. Or like if the child is upset with the parent and is voicing that on with communication with this person, they can really play on that and state, oh, well, they must not really love you, but I really care about you. And just really try to build trust and manipulate the child into thinking that they're cared for more by the other person. And then they can oftentimes then, hey, let's meet up and go do something fun. And that's when it's really, I hate to use the term too late because we're never going to stop trying to protect our children, but they're already in a bad situation at that point. So it's really important that parents are monitoring what's going on online, possibly not even allowing some of the electronic devices where they can be behind closed doors. There's different software programs that they can use to help monitor, but they're not foolproof. So I think it's important that parents do due diligence and also make sure that they're monitoring themselves. And then knowing who your children are with, I think is really important. So if they were saying, I'm going to go meet up with a friend, who is this friend, like getting some information and trying to make sure that you know who they're talking to and who they're with.
Yeah, no, that's really important, especially in today's day and age where children are spending most of their times in front of the computer or using their gadgets and mobile phones. And sometimes for parents who are, working full time, have day jobs, it's difficult for them to kind of monitor the children all the time. So yes. I think that's where technology comes in to offer that kind of assurance and support.
I think that does help. I think that, like you said, we're all busy. So I even have to make a determined effort to ensure that I'm looking at different things, even with all that I'm aware of, trying to make sure that I take that time to do that. But just as important, I think it's important to make sure that we are teaching our kids. So if we teach our kids what to look for and just different methods of deception and things like that as well, they can also be an advocate for themselves. So that I want to make sure I don't leave out that part because that's a huge factor in it as well. So,
I mean, when it comes to child abuse, we know that it occurs at every socioeconomic level, ethnicities, culture, race, religion, and backgrounds. But what we can do, and like you said, that it is preventable, and we can kind of prevent it through education and awareness. And especially in today's day and time when it's really difficult for people to kind of monitor their kids all the time, especially when they become teenagers, for example, and start going out on their own. Right. They're not under their parents' supervision anymore. It becomes even more harder to
yes.
Yes,
I agree. And I think that if we are providing the educational background and also have built a strong relationship with our children, that as they get older, they're going to think on those things as they are approached with different situations. It does not mean that they're not going to possibly make a mistake and trust somebody that they shouldn't, because I think most of us have probably done that at some point. But it does mean not only do they have resources in the beginning to try to help prevent the situation, but then if they also have that relationship with you, they can come back to you with any concerns or questions or something didn't feel right. So being that sounding board, I think, is important to establish as well.
One thing you mentioned, Tara, which is extremely important, is to have that trusting relationship between the children and the parents, where the child can trust the parent in the sense that they know that if they share something, they won't be told off or criticized or punished. Because unfortunately, in some cases, children don't have that kind of relationship with their caregivers, and they're fearful of them for whatever reasons. And yes, often when you're under the age of 18, you don't really know how to communicate, especially when you're a child. Communication is another thing. You don't know how to explain certain things or use certain words, or what words to use to kind of express what's going on. So what can parents do, or teachers even, to encourage children to communicate?
I think that starts with things that aren't like abuse. So if they want to tell you a story about their day, making the time for that and stopping what you're doing, and giving them that one-on-one time and communicating with them on their level about their interests or their concerns or things like that that aren't so massive. That is how you build the relationship and the trust, so that when it does come to these bigger things, they know that, okay, my parent has been there, or the teacher has been there, because teachers play a huge part in this as well. If there's abuse at home, teachers are often the ones that are there to notice that something doesn't seem right, and report if something is wrong. So they also, just the day-to-days, how are you? And noticing if things, a lot of teachers now, if a child doesn't seem to have food with them, they keep a drawer full of food, or whatever the situation, whatever the needs might be, they're keeping some supplies on hand so that they can help build trust with the children that way and provide for some of those basic needs that they might be lacking for, might not even be abusive situation, but maybe just a situation where there's financial lack right now. And so those are ways to build trust, and that way the teacher then could also be someone that the child trusts to come with bigger things.
I totally agree with everything you've said. And often if there is abuse going on at home, I think teachers would be the first point of contact, because I think according to statistics, 60% of children who have been abused, they have been abused by somebody the family trusts. So yes, it usually happens, in places where the child may feel safe, like a home or somebody else's house, a relative's house, or even right, a neighbor. And 90% of children who have experienced any form of child abuse, who have been victimized, they know their abuser. Yes. So that makes it even more difficult and challenging, because how do you disclose it to another family member or a relative or a neighbor that the person who's doing this or who did this is a relative or a sibling or a parent? So what's the best way to address that?
Many times the children are afraid to tell. And maybe it's because they've been told that if they tell, they're going to get in trouble. Many times it could be because they know that it is a close family member, and what's going to happen if I tell? Are people going to believe me? Or is that person going to get into trouble? Like, that's often a concern for children, like their abuser getting into trouble. And many times the kids, if they are younger, for instance, they don't have the terminology to use to be able to state certain things, and just may not know how to word certain things, like you said. So I think that is where it's important that parents or other people who are caring for the child are really watching for those signs, like a change in behavior, a display of fear, and just like the child not wanting to be in the presence of somebody should be something that we watch, and we're asking, maybe not the child questions, but start asking ourselves questions as far as and then, possibly, depending on how old the kid is, asking the child questions. Is there, are you afraid of something? Is everything okay? Like, and trying to see, like, generally, if they will state anything, because it may just be, if they just act upset one time about seeing the child, maybe the child didn't get something that they wanted the last time that they saw that person. So it doesn't always mean that there's abuse, but when there is a display of fear, there's usually a problem. So, and I think it's really important that we don't push children to, for instance, have physical contact with somebody that they seem to be uncomfortable having physical contact with. So a lot of times family members will be like, oh, go hug so-and-so. That's part of the family. And if the child doesn't want to, I think it's important that we watch that. And it may have nothing to do with abuse. But I think it's important that we are teaching our children that if they're uncomfortable with something, they don't have to be pressured into physical contact with somebody if that's not what they're comfortable with. They have some body autonomy and decisions to make regarding who touches their body. So I do feel that it's important that we watch things like that as well.
That's extremely important what you just said. We also need to educate our children and teach them from a really young age how to differentiate between a good touch and a bad touch, and how to kind of identify if they should trust someone or allow someone to give them a hug or a cuddle, or just kind of distance themselves. So that's something I think parents can do from a really young age. And I'm not sure whether all schools teach children about these things. I know some schools do. From a very young age, they kind of educate children when it comes to these things. And they have like child abuse prevention programs where they'll invite the speaker to come in, show maybe a cartoon or like an animated video. So just so that children kind of know what to do if there is a potential risk. Yes.
I don't think enough schools do that. And why I think it's important to be teaching at home. Why I also believe that it is important to be teaching in school is because so many children are abused in the home that they're not going to be taught those things there. So it's important that they are taught somewhere what is okay and what's not okay. But many schools do not have that type of program. And I do believe that it is very important. And there's lots of discussions here in the United States about possible programs being set in place for that to be a more established type of curriculum.
Yeah, definitely. And I think not just from educational institutions, but in so many other, settings as well. For example, mosques, churches, places of worship, and public places where children often go for activities, whether it's a leisure center or a club.
Yes. Yeah, the more education we can provide, the greater the possibility, if not complete prevention, because there are some things that we can't prevent, then at least helping them to understand what's okay and what's not okay so that they are not scared about reporting and trying to get help for the situation. So I think that we could make a big difference if more of these cases were reported.
Yeah. In certain parts of the world, in certain parts societies, it's quite difficult for the victim to share their experience with someone because of the mindsets that people often have and the victim blaming that comes along. And often, I'm sure you have seen so many cases where people experience something like this in their childhood, and after 30, 40 years or 50 years, they kind of shared it with someone. And
Yes.
they were carrying that, that experience, those feelings and emotions all their life, and it was impacting all other relationships that they had or they formed throughout life. So, say for example, if someone experienced it in their childhood, but at that time there was no help available, there were no resources, there was no reporting service.
Right.
But now that they are a bit older, they could be in their late teens, 20s, 30s, what can they do now to help themselves?
I do think it helps to be able to share your story, because there is a part of you feels shame if you have to keep that a secret, even though you should not feel shame. So a lot of people feel shame until they can share their story and have that story accepted and not experience victim blaming. Oftentimes victims are re-victimized by trying to reach out for help and then having situations of possible further abuse, or people not believing them, or even going through the judicial system sometimes can feel re-victimizing. So I think that it's important that we find a safe place to share our story. And then also things such as counseling are a huge help, because there are professionals who have tools to share with you that then can help lead to additional healing. And it's hard to grow until you can heal. So I think it's really important that we have the opportunity to start that healing process so we can continue to grow and expound in our lives. So something I find really, really interesting is that your brain changes with trauma. The connections change. There are all kinds of things that change in your brain as you experience a traumatic event. But it's really awesome how our brain works, and how it's a situation in the right environment, it's a healing environment, it changes again and creates new neural networks, and has a healing process going on inside the brain, so that then you can continue to heal and grow. And I just think that it's awesome that even though a physical part of our body changes through trauma, it can also change back, not back. It never changes back to its original form, but it changes through the healing process as well.
That is extremely powerful. I mean, if we could understand what we're capable of and what our brain is capable of, I'm sure a lot of people would think differently, act differently, and healing is a possibility. It's something you can achieve.
Yes.
We have talked about children. We've talked about teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, and it really enrages me, and it's something that I just can't really get my head around, but I remember a few years ago, I received a phone call from this lady, and she was clearly distressed and crying, and she said that she's got a baby, a 6-month-old baby, and she just found out that the baby is being abused by her husband, who is also the father of that infant, and he holds like a really reputable position in the community, and she doesn't really know how to disclose it, where to go, how to seek help, and most importantly, how to stop it. So for a baby who may not, of course, definitely not remember these experiences and will not be able to do anything as that child grows older, but for the person who is a witness to this, they also experience what we call secondary trauma.
Yes.
And like you said, often people feel guilty and ashamed, not because of something that they have done, but because of the things that others have done to them. And there's this guilt that we allowed it to happen to us, although it's never your fault and you never allow it to happen, but it's just that's how people often feel.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on this?
I think that that would be one of the hardest things to deal with, is your child being abused. When it's yourself, it's very difficult. There's no taking away from that at all. But every parent who is protective of their child and has a child that goes through something like that, it's very difficult to fight that feeling of shame, because you feel like, what could I have done? I should have done something more in order to prevent that. That is not always the case. In that situation, for instance, that mother is not to blame at all, for a situation to where she did not take part in that abuse. She's trying to find methods of protecting her child. So I hope that she will also reach out for assistance in her healing process, because she has a healing process to go through as well. And then the best situation for that healing process to take place for herself, which will then in turn help with any residual issues that the child may have, even though they are a baby, would be to remove themselves from that situation first, so that they can heal. It's very difficult to heal if you continue to be subjected to abuse. So that would be my first recommendation.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, there are also plenty of cases where one of the family members or a parent may be well aware of what's going on, what's happening with their child, but they choose to remain silent for whatever reasons. But unfortunately, this does happen. And yes. I remember interviewing a child who was not more than, I think, 12 years of age. And she said that her mother knows exactly what's going on at home, what the stepfather is doing. But she's too fearful of him. And she doesn't really know what to do and how to stop it, because he then starts beating her, abusing her. So it's like the child and the mother both in an abusive situation, living with the perpetrator under the same roof.
Yes.
What can be done in a situation like this?
If other family members are aware of the situation, I hope that they will provide some sort of support in order to, again, removal from that situation is the number one priority for both the mother and the daughter. Without support, that's very difficult to do, because when there's abuse like that going on, oftentimes there are not financial resources available. The financial resources may all be controlled by the abuser. And without financial resources, it's nearly impossible to leave, only because where do you go? When you leave, you have to have somewhere to go.
Of course.
So I think that hopefully there is some support with family members. If not, and many places there are support. So there's support available through things such as battered women and children's shelters, and different places who are like NGOs that are set up to help survivors of different forms of abuse. And they also help provide for different needs that need to be met in order for them to be able to get away from that situation.
Yeah. And like you said, yeah, please go on.
Sorry. Then once they are out of that situation, I think it's important that they both get the assistance that they need with their mental and emotional well-being as well.
Yeah, definitely. Talking about emotional and mental and physical well-being, because this is something that you're going to be affected, and it will have long-term effects, whether you're a child or an adult or a witness even. First of all, what are some of the signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress or complex post-traumatic stress that a survivor may be experiencing? And then maybe talk about the long-term effects of child abuse in later adulthood.
Okay. As far as post-traumatic stress, that is something that can be displayed in different ways. when people are experiencing that, but it's all based on having a high alert to different situations that might trigger a memory or trigger something inside of them, a feeling that causes them to almost go back in time into the situation that they experienced that was traumatic. And so some of the effects, the long-term effects of experiencing this type of trauma in childhood can be post-traumatic stress disorder. So many people do have that after experiencing different forms of abuse, but they also have a higher risk of depression, a higher risk of mental illnesses such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. So there are many different types of issues that they may have in that regard. But then also, you mentioned earlier, issues with future relationships are a possibility. It can impact that. Also, drug and alcohol abuse may be increased because there's a lot of pain, yes, internal pain involved in abuse, being a victim of abuse. That's not just physical. The physical is oftentimes the easiest to heal. So there's a lot of pain that people endure that if they don't have the opportunity to go through a healthy healing process and have the support that they need, sometimes they're looking for something to numb that pain. So that increased risk of drug or alcohol abuse is a possibility as well. Their view of self is almost always impacted when they've gone through any type of chronic abuse as a child, that then as they're growing up, it's hard to separate themselves and their identity from what they went through. And one of my biggest messages is that you are not what you've been through. It's just what you've been through, but that does not mean that's who you are. And so I think it's really important that they have the opportunity for healing so that those increased risks aren't in play. And I know that I don't know if you've heard of the ACE score. So it basically was a study that was done on children who have experienced abuse and the impacts that it's had in their adulthood. And there's an increased risk of the things that we mentioned, and then also an increased risk in autoimmune diseases. And because that stress, that chronic stress, is unhealthy for your physical body as well. So there's many different long-term effects that can come into play from childhood abuse.
Yeah, like you mentioned, addictions and even societal consequences, where you can see that if somebody has experienced it, they may even kind of normalize this kind of behavior and may start acting like the same way as the perpetrator did when they were a child with their children, maybe.
Yes.
And I've seen this, that often, parents who go for a really strict form of parenting or to discipline their child, resort to physical punishments, beating, hitting, striking, or, deprive them of food or what have you. And if you kind of dig deep, you find out that they were often subjected to these same things when they were children by their caregivers. And it's like this transgenerational,
cycle
style that tends to kind of continue. And someone needs to break this.
Yes.
And this is where I think help, going for counseling or therapy, comes in, and it's extremely beneficial.
Because if that's all that somebody knows as they grow up, they don't know the other tools that can be utilized that would be healthy and effective in dealing with their own children. So that cycle is often repeated if people don't have the ability to heal. So I agree. So
we have like 5 minutes left, and I would like to, in the end, focus on your own personal journey, Tara. And I'm so grateful to you, first of all, and I really, really appreciate the fact that you've come this far and you're doing so much, and you're playing your part in educating people, in spreading awareness, and doing whatever you can to ensure that nobody else experiences what you personally experienced. Yes. In your life, in your past. If you could talk about that, please, so that our viewers can know what an amazing person you are.
Thank you. My abuse started when I was 5. My biological parents had divorced, and my mother had remarried my stepfather when I was 4. And he did adopt me, but I still refer to him as my stepdad. But he began sexually abusing me at the age of 5. And as time went on, he also was very emotionally abusive and at times physically abusive. The physical abuse wasn't as often as the sexual abuse and the emotional abuse. And that continued until I was 17 when I left home. So it was a situation to where pretty much my entire childhood, I had dealt with that type of abuse, and it definitely impacted every area of my life. And I'm one of the people that you had talked about earlier, where I left a situation that was abusive as a child. I left when I was still a child at 17 and ended up quickly in a relationship with another abuser, which was my first husband. And so it's a situation to where oftentimes people go from abuse to abuse. And it took me many years before I was out of all of the abusive situations in order to be able to heal and grow, and then hopefully provide hope to other people who are going through hard situations.
When did you recognize this as abuse? Because often when people are on the receiving end, when they are the victims, they don't really acknowledge or recognize or understand what's going on or what's happening to them. When and how did you reach that moment when you realized, okay, this is unacceptable and this is abuse and I should leave?
When I was very young, I knew that it didn't seem right, but you're not always able to recognize it, because back when I was younger, it wasn't discussed as often. So I didn't get that education. But probably like middle school into high school, I started seeing that other people weren't afraid and other people didn't seem to be going through the situations that I was. And so tying that together with the fact that it did not feel right was how I started forming those decisions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Tara. I'm completely speechless. I really do admire you for courage and bravery. And I really wish you all the best with the work that you're doing. And if there's any final message you would like to give to our audience.
You are valuable. So if you are experiencing this, a lot of times you feel as though you don't hold value. And it's really important that you understand that you do have a purpose in this world and you are worth fighting for. So it is okay to reach out for help. And there are people who do care and are there to help you.
Thank you. That was really powerful. Thank you so much, Tara. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
To all the people who are watching this program, first of all, thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions, any concerns, any feedback, or anything that you would like to share with Tara or our team at Hidayat TV, please call in our studio or leave a message or a comment on our Facebook and YouTube page. If you want to directly contact Tara for support, we will be more than happy to connect you with her. Just leave your details in our studio. We'll see you again next Saturday with another guest around another topic around mental health and an amazing guest. And till then, look after yourselves and each other. Assalamu alaikum.